Hello everybody on YouTube land. This will be part 2 of the Scriptural Passover. I'm going to pick up where I left off from part 1. Some people argue that Yahshua did not even eat the Passover. One such attempt is to maintain that when Yahshua broke the bread, the Greek word artos was used. Artos typically means bread that has been leavened, while the Greek word for unleavened bread is azumos. The Hebrew equivalents are lacham, which is generally a general term for bread, and usually means leavened bread, and matzah for unleavened bread. Now, as we will see, the scripture clearly demonstrates that this meal was the Passover. But beyond that, we only have to look into the word of Yahweh to discover that even Yahweh refers to matzah as lacham in Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. We'll be reading from King James. Thou shalt eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days thou shalt eat unleavened bread, which is matzah. Therewith even the bread, lacham, of affliction. For thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt in haste, that thou mayest remember the day when thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of thy life. Yahweh himself called unleavened bread matzah, the bread, or lacham, of affliction. You know why? Because unleavened bread is still bread. Especially when we look at all the evidence to the contrary, it is no proof that Yahshua did not eat Passover based solely on the fact that he broke, in Greek, artos, since it can just as easily be azumos, artos of affliction. Just as we saw matzah, lacham, of affliction. So let's look at one of the silly arguments, besides the one I just read, on why we don't have to observe Passover. There are some that use Paul's writings to say we don't have to keep Passover. And they use 1 Corinthians 5, 7, and 8. Verse 7. Therefore cleanse out the old leaven, so that you are a new lump, as you are unleavened. For also Messiah our Passover was offered for us. So then let us observe the festival, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of evil and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. These verses trip a lot of people up, especially the last part of verse 7, where Paul said, For also Messiah our Passover was offered for us. People will take these verses, duct tape them to other verses that call the Messiah the Lamb, and say, bam! There you go, the Messiah is the Passover Lamb. So because Paul said, Messiah our Passover was offered for us, we don't have to keep the Passover anymore. They overlook what Paul actually said in verse 8. He straight up says, So then let us observe the festival. Say that again. So then let us observe the festival. Paul is telling us to observe the festival. The biggest thing most people overlook with this verse is the fact that most of this chapter is figurative, not literal. Let me read verse 7 again. Therefore cleanse out the old leaven, so that you are a new lump, as you are unleavened. For also Messiah, our Passover, was offered for us. Are you a literal lump of dough? No. Paul's reference to Messiah being our Passover is figurative also, if we're going to stay consistent. So what about verse 8? So then let us observe the festival, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of evil and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Is that literal unleavened bread? I've never eaten a piece of unleavened bread that is sincerity and truth flavored. I know that might sound ridiculous, but it is also ridiculous to use 1 Corinthians 5, 7, and 8 to do away with the everlasting command in the everlasting Torah of Yahweh. Let me share a quick quote from an article. It's been a long time since I read it, so I can't remember the name of it. Quote, The meal that Yeshua and the disciples ate was obviously a preparatory meal, not the Passover meal itself. And he's referring to the Last Supper meal. Why are there not any other examples of the people of Yahweh eating a preparatory meal in Scripture? Is that the only one? These were grown Jewish men with the son of Elohim as their master who celebrated Passover their whole lives. Why in the world would they need to perform a preparatory meal for something they've been doing their whole lives? If this was the preparation day, as the author claims of the article that I just quoted from, why would they spend all their Passover prep time on a preparatory meal instead of the actual Passover? Question: does Yeshua mean what he say? Is he a liar? Matthew 26:17 and 18. And on the first day of unleavened bread, the taught ones came to Yeshua, saying to him, "Where do you wish us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man, and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to observe the Passover at your house with my taught ones." Why would Yeshua tell his taught ones to go find a place where they're going to observe the Passover if they didn't observe the Passover? Why would he say that if they just did a preparatory meal? Doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a command for the Passover in the Torah. Where is the command for the preparatory meal? Yeshua ate the Passover. If he didn't, he would be sinning. There are some that would say that we can't observe Passover because we are not where Yahweh's name dwells. And they have this issue because, or this belief, because of Deuteronomy 16. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6. Verse 1. Guard the month of Abib, and perform the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim. For in the month of Abib, Yahweh your Elohim brought you out of the Mitzrayim by night. You shall slaughter the Passover to Yahweh your Elohim from the flock and the herd, in the place where Yahweh chooses to put his name. Eat no leavened bread with it. For 7 days you eat unleavened bread with it, bread of affliction. Because you came out of the land of Mitzrayim in haste, so that you remember the day in which you came out of the land of Mitzrayim all the days of your life. And no leaven should be seen with you in all your border for 7 days. Neither should any of the meat which you slaughter in the evening on the first day stay all night until morning. You are not allowed to slaughter the Passover within any of your gates which Yahweh your Elohim gives you. And here's the kicker. But at the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to make his name dwell, there you shall slaughter the Passover in the evening at the going down of the sun, at the appointed time you came out of Mitzrayim. People will look at this verse and say, we can't do Passover because we're not in Jerusalem, where his name dwells. Does Yahweh's name really dwell in Jerusalem? Let's think about it for a minute. Does Yahweh's name dwell where there's gay day or gay parades? No. Does his name dwell in a place where his name is suppressed, not even called upon? Where people don't even call his name? I'm sure that there are some individuals that actually call Yahweh by name, but for the most part, that doesn't happen over there. Because traditional Judaism does not teach that. It teaches to call him Adonai or Hashem, which is pretty much a slap in the face to Yahweh. Because there's so many commands about calling him by name. Does Yahweh's name dwell in a mosque? Because I'm sure there's a few Muslim mosques in Jerusalem. Because they're always fighting over the Temple Mount. No, his name does not dwell in a mosque. Yahweh's name does not dwell in Jerusalem. Sorry, folks. It just doesn't. His name dwells where his people are. I want to read a couple verses. Hopefully that it will help the argument about we can't do it because that's where his name. We can't do it because we're not where his name dwells. I'm going to read from the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 11, verse 16 and 17. Therefore say, thus said the Master Yahweh, although I have sent them far off among the Gentiles, and although I have scattered them among the lands, yet I was for them a set apart place for a while in the lands to which they came. Therefore say, Thus said the Master Yahweh, and I shall gather you from the peoples, and I shall assemble you from the lands where you have been scattered, and I shall give you the land of Israel. It says in verse 17, Yahweh will bring back the people to the land of Israel. But in verse 16, Yahweh said he was a set-apart place for a little while. This was written after the command was given in Deuteronomy 16. So Israel was scattered at this time. They were not in Jerusalem. Does that mean they didn't observe Passover because of what Deuteronomy 16 says? Don't think so. Simply because the Passover is to be observed forever, an everlasting law throughout your generations. We can see Yahweh's mercy in verse 16 of Ezekiel 11. Yahweh knows he gave the command to do unleavened bread, Shavuot, and Sukkot where his name dwells, but he is merciful enough to make a way to still observe his feast outside of Jerusalem. You can't put Yahweh in a box, people. Stop doing that. It's exactly what you're doing. I believe we are in the same predicament that Israel was in verse 16 of Ezekiel 11. Yahweh's name does not dwell in Jerusalem anymore, so we have to serve him where we live. I find it funny that some believers will quote from Deuteronomy 16 to try and prove that we can't observe Passover here in America and other countries. They're not Israel. Because we're not in Jerusalem where his name dwells, but they still observe Shavuot or Pentecost and Sukkot or the Feast of Tabernacles, when those are also mentioned in Deuteronomy 16, the same chapter, that they try and prove that we can't do Passover. That's not very consistent. That's very inconsistent. If we don't eat a lamb or goat that has been sacrificed, we are not observing Passover. Just having bread and wine or a leg of lamb we bought from the store is not observing Passover. The Israelites back in the day did not run up to Kroger to buy some lamb to observe the Passover. They slaughtered the Passover themselves. Just like Yeshua and his taught ones did, just like they did back in Mitzrayim. If you don't slaughter and eat a lamb or a goat at Passover, you are not observing the Passover. Anything short of that is a replacement of what Yahweh commanded in the Torah. You are observing a counterfeit. I have a question and a challenge for everyone out there in YouTube land on this topic. Can you show me one example in Scripture where believers observed a lambless or goatless Passover? Or another way to ask it, can you show one example in Scripture where believers observed Passover with just bread and wine? You can't do it because it's not in there. That's how they did it in the Torah. That's how the prophets did it. And that's how Yeshua and his taught ones did it. We should observe the everlasting command in the Torah and follow Yeshua's example when it comes to keeping the Passover. Shalom.